Hello and welcome to my studio. These are some new colors in a new palette that I just put together using Rembrandt paints. All the colors are listed in the description. I'm going to start with lavender, and I'm going to paint the beautiful statice flowers in the foreground of this seascape of Laguna Beach. This is looking south along the coastline towards Divers Cove from a very special place called Heisler Park. I forgot to mention that I'm painting on a beautiful pad of 7" by 10" 100% cotton 300 GSM or 140-pound paper, also made by Rembrandt, and this paper is on a block, which means that all four sides are glued except for a little 1" space on the side that you can use to remove the piece of paper from the top of the watercolor block. And at the very end of this video, I show you exactly how to do that. So I'm going to be mixing the colors on the paper for a lot of this painting. The surface of this paper is a cold press surface, but it's a smoother cold press surface than something like Arches paper, if you're familiar with that. It's a finer texture, and it's really beautiful to work on. But because it's slightly finer and has a good amount of sizing, it's very easy to work with, and it's very easy to get some puddles of water on top of the paper in spaces where you want to have colors mix on their own on the paper, which is really a fun way to paint. You can always mix colors in your palette, and this palette has plenty of room for mixing, but I do like the look of colors running together on the paper. When they dry, they sometimes have a really nice texture as well. So for the ocean, in the reference photo, it's very lavender looking because there's a lot of sea foam, but I know this beach and the water in the ocean is very greenish blue. So I've used Cobalt turquoise, one of my new colors, and I've also mixed some phthalo green. So Cobalt turquoise is a somewhat opaque watercolor, and the phthalo color is transparent. So having the two together is a nice combination. The lavender color that I use for the statice flowers in the foreground is semi-opaque, and so is rose. In fact, quite a lot of this palette is semi-opaque, but it's a really bright, luminous palette with just really happy colors. It's not a very traditional palette, but it does have a good amount of reds, yellows, and blues in warm and cool shades. As the ocean moves back towards the horizon, I added cobalt blue because the ocean water gets cooler and becomes a deeper blue as it heads towards the horizon. To add some texture to the water, I've added some strokes of cobalt turquoise with less water on my brush. This helps the colors stay where you put them for the most part because there isn't extra water to have those colors move around. I'm using Hooker's Green to paint the palm trees, and after I put the initial Hooker's Green down, I'm going to come back in with a little bit of yellow on the right side of each tree to catch the sunlight. The sunlight is coming from the right-hand side. When I paint watercolors, I typically like to paint the things in the foreground first, and I move around from foreground to middle ground to background and so on. But I usually put in the sky last, and I usually paint the foreground things first. And then when I paint the sky around them, I leave a little bit of a white halo or white paper between so that the sky color doesn't bump into the green or the yellow in this case and pull those colors out into the sky. Also, leaving a little white halo around the edges of the trees emphasizes the sunlight and the sparkle that they would have if you were there looking at them. Now I'm going to use Naples Yellow Red shade. I'm going to use this color to get my cliff started. Naples Yellow Red shade is a really useful color. It's a very light, pale salmon color, and it's a great color to put down as a base. For instance, I can put it down as a base for this cliff, and then I can drop in some other colors on top of it, and the colors will mix around and it'll look very natural. It's also a good color to use for flesh, for flowers, And even for leaves, it mixes very nicely with green to make natural looking leaf colors. I'm mixing a little bit of burnt umber into the cliff color, and you can see that the colors moving around on the paper are creating beautiful textures and a very natural looking sea cliff. So in the reference photo, the cliff and the beach are very similar in value and in color, but I want them to separate on my painting. So I'm using golden ochre by itself and quite a bit of water to paint in the beach. This makes it look a little sunnier and a little more yellow than the colors on the cliff, which are sort of a reddish gold and brownish gold. Notice how I'm coming down towards the flowers in the foreground, but I'm not coming too close to them, and I'm leaving a white halo around them. I love the contrast in color temperature between the beach and the cool status flowers. I'm adding a little extra cadmium yellow on top of the beach to make it look even yellower and sunnier. I'm pushing the colors a little bit from the reference photo because I really like to do that in my watercolor paintings and my oil paintings, just because I love color. I like my paintings to be bright and cheerful, and that's one way to get them to look that way. Just kind of push the colors, make things look sunnier, a little more yellow, a little brighter, and so on. For the sky, I started with cobalt blue, and I'm starting from the top and I'm bringing it down around the trees and around the outer edges of the clouds. I'm also going to add some ultramarine blue to the very top of the sky to make it slightly deeper and just to add an extra layer of a different color. I'm using ultramarine blue and a lot of water to put the very light blue sky on the horizon and painting carefully in between my trees. I'm going to soften the edges around the outside of the clouds with just a little bit of water while the paint is still wet. And then I'm going to add a very, very slight hint of rose to the horizon. The clouds are kind of a purplish gray, so I've mixed ultramarine blue, yellow ochre, and a tiny bit of quinacridone rose to make this violet color. Notice how I'm painting the purple colors within the white shapes of the clouds, but I'm not coming all the way to the edge. I don't want the purple to touch the blue on the top edges of the clouds. I want them to really look puffy and sunny and bright and tall. Here's the little bit of rose that I'm going to add to the horizon. It sort of creates depth in seascapes to add a slight pinkish or reddish tone on the horizon. And in the case of Southern California, it also kind of makes it look like drifting fog. Isn't that beautiful? For the sky reflected into the wet sand, I'm using just ultramarine blue and quite a lot of white. I'm making all of my strokes vertical, and I'm using my number 8 brush. This is the largest brush that I've used on this painting. Notice how I'm leaving spaces of white in between my vertical strokes. I want the reflection to have the look of vertical strokes, but be very, very light. So I need to leave white spaces in between. And also notice when I come all the way down to the bottom, just above the status flowers, I'm not touching the flowers with the paint. I'm leaving that white halo. Now I'm using permanent green, or yellowish green, excuse me, and I'm painting some beautiful yellowish green flowers in between the status. These flowers and leaves are in the foreground, and the job of the foreground is to capture the attention of the viewer with bright, punchy colors. You can use colors in this space right out of the tube. You can also have your darkest darks and your lightest lights. This painting is going to have what's called a vignette in the foreground. A vignette is when the foreground is slightly finished around the bottom and the lower right and left-hand corners. That means leaving some white spaces. Some people make vignettes with really bright colors and they leave a lot of white, and other people make vignettes with dark colors, and sometimes they even just leave the drawing empty and sort of naked at the bottom of the painting without any paint on it. So there are a lot of different ways to do a vignette, but it's a beautiful design feature and it works really well for small paintings like this one. As I applied the green to the plants and things on the hillside of the cliff, notice how I left a lot of white spaces there? I did that on purpose because I'm planning to come back later and add some pinks and oranges to indicate the flowers on the ice plants that are growing on the cliff. For the sea rocks, I'm using a mixture of neutral tint, which is the dark on this palette, and also burnt umber. Neutral tint is a really nice color, and it's exactly as it's described. It's very neutral. I used to use a lot of Payne's gray for my darks and sometimes ivory black, but I've switched to neutral tint recently, and I really like the color combinations I can get with it. It's very versatile. It's not quite as strong as Payne's gray, and I would say it's not brown and it's not a bluish dark like Payne's gray, but just a really nice, beautiful, versatile color if you want to have a dark on your palette. And you can mix it very easily with reds and browns and blues if you want to tint it further in one direction and still have a dark, natural looking color. It's also the color that I'm using for the trunks of the palm trees. Now I'm adding the pink and red flowers in the distance. I'm using a combination of permanent red deep, also Quinacridone rose, and I'm also going to pick up Pyrole orange. These are all transparent colors, and I'm letting some of those colors go right into the white spaces, but I'm also letting some of those colors run into the green. When you mix green with a little bit of red, it tones it down or grays it down, and because these flowers are in the middle ground on the cliff, I want those greens to be slightly toned down from the greens in the foreground. This will help create the look of depth in my painting. I'm also using Hooker's green with my number 6 brush to add some detailed dark green strokes to the sides of the cliff, especially where the plants are right up to the edge and starting to flow over, and also where they're right underneath the palm trees. I would imagine that the palm trees are casting a slight shadow on the greenery, even though I can't really see that in the reference photo. I'm just filling out some more details, some more dark green details on the cliffside with Hooker's green and a little bit of burnt sienna as well. I don't want to put in too much detail, but I definitely want to show the beautiful texture of the plants on the side of the cliff. Now that I have most of the surface of the painting covered, it's time to go in and emphasize some of the darks and lights and warms and cools. So now I'm going to use Quinacridone Purple Bluish to add some dark accents in the status flowers in the foreground. I'm being careful not to overdo this, and I'm also being careful to not use too much water. I'm using a number 6 brush, and I'm also painting in some of the stems. Again, I don't want to overdo the detail in the foreground because I want this to be a vignette, which means kind of an unfinished look, but I definitely want to have a few details in the foreground flowers. I'm adding some dark green accents in the foreground as well, but I'm keeping the green pretty warm. So I'm using Hooker's green and a little bit of cadmium yellow to make this color. Again, I'm not using too much water. I'm being very careful to have just the smallest amount of water on my brush so that when I put a stroke of paint down on the paper, it stays where I put it and doesn't mix with the other colors. I'm also going to add some texture to the beach. I'm using Quinacridone Purple Bluish mixed with burnt sienna. I don't want to overdo the texture, but I just want to add a little bit of just a few lines and dots and things like that. I'm also going to put some of this color close to the reflection in the wet sand. I'm not going to go along the whole line of the reflection, but just here and there I'm going to make a little shape of it to emphasize the reflection. Lavender plus Naples yellow reddish, and I'm adding some colors between the palm tree trunks for that sea cliff that's really far in the distance. After I put that color down, I'm going to go back in and add a little bit of green. I'm just using some of the green on my palette. I don't want it to be too clean looking. Just a little bit of green, just a hint of it in the distance. The reason for this color is I don't want the color of the sea cliff to be too close to the value and color of the clouds, and I don't want it to be too close to the color of green in the cliff that is in the middle of the painting. So I chose a color and a value that's in between. I feel that the ocean needs a little more texture, so I'm adding some strokes of cobalt turquoise with just a hint of cobalt blue mixed in as well. I'm going to add some bright cadmium yellow in the foliage in the foreground and down around the flowers. Just wanting to bring that extra bright, pretty yellow and the look of sunshine into the foreground of this painting. I want the feeling to be like the viewer is standing on the cliff in the sun, overlooking all these beautiful flowers and out into the beautiful ocean and the sky. I'm using ultramarine blue and a fairly dry brush to add a few more strokes of deep blue in the ocean. For the final finishing touch, I'm adding just an extra hint of blue from the sky down into the wet sand reflection. I'm using a small brush and making vertical strokes, and then I'm going to sweep across with a couple of horizontal strokes to give it movement. Now I'm going to use a plastic disposable knife to cut the paper off of the block. You want to pull from left to right as you move it between the sheets of paper, very gently and slowly around each side until it's completely free. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed painting the scene of Laguna Beach with me.